Oh, hello, my friends. It's been a little bit of a break, but it's nice to be back with you. This is PerfBytes. I'm Mark Tomlinson, your chief performacologist here in the PerfBytes land, and welcome to a little bit of PerfBytes goodness, or awesomeness if you're Joe Colantonio. Speaking of which, there was a really good Joe Colantonio SRE performance interview back before CAST with our good friend Eric Pregler. And I listened to that, and I miss hanging out with Eric Pregler, and we'll talk about Whopper in a little bit. Today's topic is understanding scalability in 2022, because it's still a problem, apparently, for Ticketmaster. Anyway, and things like that. So we want to have a little bit of a recap. Actually, I was talking at work about this, as well as with another person in the office hours, about scalability and how to understand modern architectures and scalability. So we're going to talk about that. I'll do a little bit of whiteboarding. But of course, first, giving a shout out to all the sponsors and supporters of PerfBytes. Off the top of the list, our friends at Abstracta. And I want to give a shout out to Roger and Fede if they pop over onto this. I still owe Fede an abstract for the talk I'm giving. I'm going to be flying all the way down to Uruguay for the workshop on performance and reliability. If you've never heard about Whopper, it's not the Whopper machine. It's not Joshua from War Games, the movie, the Whopper. It's not a sandwich from Burger King. It is the workshop on performance and reliability, or performance-workshop.org is the website. We are doing a fantastic topic on iterative performance testing, which is a broad enough scope that you could bring all sorts of experiences. And I'm lucky enough to join after many years to be able to do this in Uruguay. That's the week of December 5th. It's great, but it's a very, very small little conference, only by invite only. So we're going to probably have podcasting or something at the end of every evening. Leandro's going to be there, Fede, Roger, and all sorts of fantastic folks. If you're going to be at Whopper, I'll see you there. I'm really excited about it. At the end of that, at that particular week, Abstracta is hosting a conference, a testing day conference, and I want to make sure. You know what? I'm going to go look for this. Hang on just a second. It's somewhere in here. Let me go look at it. So there's another thing coming out from Joe Colantonio. It's the Quality Sense, because Quality Sense is another podcast. If you like, it's Quality Sense conference, and you're going to see some stuff on Test Guild for the Quality Sense conference. And of course, let me go look at if there's a URL I can bring. Quality Sense conference. Uruguay. All right. I should be more prepared. Look at that. Quality Sense Conf 2022. QualitySenseConf.com, which starts at 9 a.m. in Montevideo, Uruguay, December 9th. So I think it's the Friday of that week. I'm giving a talk on performance testing metrics and measures, which is everything you ever wanted to know about digging deeper into a computer system for performance in 57 minutes or less. I only leave like 3 minutes for questions. Most people are mentally exhausted by the end of that talk. And I talk really fast. So you'll want to record it or something. Of course, I may have to slow that down. I may have to edit that just if there's translation for non-English speaking folks, just to be respectful of that. So anyway, these great things are happening, going to be all the way down there. My first trip ever to Uruguay. I'm very excited about it. But the workshop on performance and reliability, as well as the Quality Sense Conference 2022 on December 9th. I think you could still get tickets. You can sign up if you feel like going. It's going to be a blast. There's a lot of great speakers that are going to be there. Not just about performance. It's about all sorts of things around quality. Now, I'll give our thanks to our usual sponsors, which would be Catchpoint APM and that fantastic tool with references. Eric was making references, web page test, and the cool stuff that Henry and Tim and those guys are actually building a web page test is really cool. It's also, Catchpoint is a full-blown APM solution as well, so give them a shout out. So thanks for their support. Catchpoint APM. is one of our key sponsors. Scott Moore Consulting. We've done some things in supporting the SMC Journal, which is his frequency, and of course the Performance Tour, which has these hilarious videos. If you've not seen them, go check out the Performance Tour as well. All the links are below in the description of this podcast. There's Neotis and Flood.io, which were Neotis and Neoload. That's where Henrik used to work, and my good friend Tim used to work with Flood.io. They're still around. And they're now under the Tricentis banner for load testing on-premise, in the cloud, both hybrid, whatever you need to do. So if you're a JMeter shop, look at Flood.io because it's a fantastic. They also support GridInit and a couple of the other cool tools, which are cool. So Flood.io, thank you very much. And Tricentis also supports Scott's work with the Performance Tour. So they're just a tremendous supporter of the performance communities and disciplines in the industry as well. So sincere thank you to the Tricentis teams. Folk Consulting, our good friend Ryan Folk. You can have all these great tools. Yeah, I know. Great thanks to Neoload and JMeter, and Leandro works with Case 6 and Load Runner and all these things. But if you want somebody that can put all of these things together with a tremendous amount of expertise, more like a performance architect, talk to Ryan Folk and Folk Consulting. They do some tremendous work with some senior level expertise to put together a practice if you want to do continuous performance work, if you want to integrate it on your pipelines, if you're working in an agile shop, if you just need to figure out how do I do this modern ephemeral stuff, if you're doing just production SRE performance work, they have a tremendous body of knowledge and expertise. So give them a call. That's Ryan Folk at Folk Consulting. And thanks to everyone for supporting PerfBytes over the years. In the new year, if anyone has any thoughts about it, I'm going to think about just going to a Patreon model, not to diss our sponsor. We could do special episodes, we could do special events, but just the run-of-the-mill support after some of the feedback I get individually, excuse me, as well as through YouTube and, expanding on YouTube. I don't think we're on Twitter much anymore. Who knows? Excuse me, who knows how that's going to turn out. So we might switch to a individual supporting membership kind of thing, which would be kind of fun, which is cool. So thanks to all of our sponsors and supporters, and we'll see you in the new year with some of that. Let's talk about scalability and the classic idea of scalability. And I'm going to go to Cam 2 here. Hopefully you guys can go with me. I'm terrible sometimes at drawing these things, but bear with me at this. If you have, this is, I'm going to say, TPS, transactions per second. And then in green, I'm going to overlay response time. So the idea that a system, and I'm doing a ramping stress test. So this is, plus 1 transactions per second over time, right? So I'm going from 0 transactions per second to N, could be 1,000, something like that. Response time in green, if I can increase the throughput on a system and response time stays about the same, right? So maybe over here I've got response time, and this is 0, 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds, whatever. We could make it algorithmic. This is with a second, and this is 10 seconds, something like that, right? Something great. And as you add more load on the system, your response times pretty much stay the same until you get to some point, and then all of a sudden you run out of a resource, right? So the knee in the curve was that phrase, the knee in the curve. And if a system is scalable, regardless of how you achieve this scalability, is the idea that under increasing load, you do not impact the end user's experience. It's a kind of simple way to make sense of it. At some point, you exhaust a potential physical resource. It could be a logical resource. So you'd run out of CPU, disk, memory, network. Those are your plain, straightforward kinds of things. At some point, you run out of a physical resource. You could run out of power. You could run out of cooling. Those are the physical pieces, right? A LinkedIn user who's anonymous says, great work. And thank you very much. I appreciate the feedback. If it's not great, let me know. We'll make it great. That'd be cool. So you'll run out of physical. You could also run out of what I call logical resources. Let's say connections in a connection pool. You could run out of licenses, interestingly enough, right? So a basic model for scalability is that, again, however I achieve, let's say when I would hit this spot here, let's say I'm running out of CPU, well, how do I add more CPU to the system? And that brings me to the next point, is that there's really two ways to think about scaling. And I'm going to say scaling, and I'm going to say there's scaling up and scaling out. Modern web technology is quite typically starved for moving data around, because we want to avoid transformation, and we already got in trouble as an industry because of the Y2K problems. So if we're like coming up with weird schemes to overload a field and shrink the bytes, and we've got plenty of bytes, we got plenty of memory and disk, so the payloads of everything are getting larger and larger and larger. So the way to maintain a level, straightforward throughput under increasing load conditions is you can scale up or scale out. And I'm going to say for scaling up, let's say you're on a single machine and you add CPU. So I'm running out of CPU, and let's say you're in a virtual machine. Well, just give me a second. All I'm going to do is repost. I'm going to recycle that virtual machine in VMware, in Citrix, in the cloud somewhere, and I'm just going to upgrade to go from a 2 CPU to a 4 CPU, or an 8 CPU to 16 CPU. A different SKU, like in Azure, or in EC2, you're gonna all right, here's the same OS, and it's really convenient. Like it used to be it takes me a month to order a new machine, and then we need to rebuild it, and the drivers are different, and there's this huge long process to scale a system up. So you did a lot of sizing and estimation to buy a giant monolithic big iron box, because you might someday, 2 years from now, need 16 CPUs or 128 CPUs. Nowadays, in the virtualization layers and the efficiencies of that, which we should all take advantage of, I just did this recently with one of our engineers. I'm like, hey, that box is running out of CPU. Could you just flip that and go to 4 or 8 CPU? And it's just restarting it. And they just move the hypervisor, probably a hypervisor change, and then they recycle it, and boom, you've got more CPU or memory. So you can add CPU, you could add memory. If you're running out of memory, and then in some, let's say disk-wise, you could move a disk is a little harder, especially if it's database. If you had disk latency from a database, you might move from, let's say, a traditional hard drive over into a disk. But it takes time to move those bytes onto an SSD, or go from a slow SSD to a faster SSD. Might take time to move those bytes around. So it's not as easy as just flipping CPU and memory. The other thing that happens in a weird way behind database loads is when it comes to disk, you can increase the speed of a disk. So there's still just one disk, but it's faster. It's like there's a CPU, but there's more of it. So you increase the speed of the disk, but keep in mind you have to move that disk, right? And moving that disk takes time. So if you're going to, hey, that disk is just running too slow. Let's say it's a database workload. You want to increase it, but you're not adding more disks. If you actually said, I was going from 1 disk to 5 disks, that's actually over here in the scaling out world. So CPU and memory, you're going to increase on the same machine a SKU or re-roll the VM, etc. Scaling up network is kind of like disk, because again, it's in the I/O side of the system. So increasing network, let's say I'm maxing out bandwidth on 1 NIC card. Well, I could go from, let's say, 1 gig to 10 gig, from 10 gig to 40 gig. So I still have one NIC card, one adapter, could be a virtual adapter, but I'm increasing bandwidth. So from networking standpoint, you could add bandwidth if you just need to move more pipe. If you needed to add multiple network adapters and maybe team them together, again, that's where it becomes scaling out. So if your workload needs more CPU and memory, but I'm just going to leave everything on one box, I'm not going to start scaling out means I'm at the max of this machine. You can't get any bigger. I can't scale up. Still keep it in one machine, but just have more resources on that one machine. Scaling out would be, instead of adding CPUs, you go from one CPU to add another machine, switch to 2 machines. So you've got one CPU on another machine and one CPU on another machine, and then plus, I'll say, N CPU. And you could do that with CPU and memory, right? CPU and memory both. So instead of adding resources to the primary machine, you figure out how to scale those machines out. Well, guess what? If you're not into load balancing, load balancing is the magic that makes everything happen here. You could put in a Nginx proxy or a load balancer, put in a F5 box, a NetScaler box, you name it. If you're going to have multiple instances, you need to do that NATed load balancing or secure NAT load balancing across multiple machines. So that scaling out means I used to send all the traffic to one machine, but now I send it to 3 machines. Scale it out. So, and another phrase you'll hear is scaling vertically versus scaling horizontally. I like to avoid that just because, like, it makes you think like you can still scale out, but add machines in a rack. And in the virtual world, we're away from the physical dimension anyway. So, I mean, scaling out. Scaling out CPU and memory means still, if you run all of these 3 boxes, these 3 virtual machines, could be containers, on the same host, you're really not scaling out. You may be scaling out if you're still physically underneath, this is all running on the same host, you didn't really scale out. So that's the real trick. Like if you have extra machines that you scale out on the cloud, hopefully by the magic of the cloud provisioning, those 3 machines are running on separate CPU, disk, and memory that are completely separate from one another. And so when you get a NIC card on all 3 of those, you're getting 3 times the actual NIC network bandwidth. If you're getting separate CPUs, they're actually 3 physically separate CPUs to do that. So scaling out logically or virtually on the same host isn't really scaling out. Maybe if you are trying to avoid a logical bottleneck, a licensing, or who knows what, connection, some default config, it's like, well, I can just run 3 of these in parallel, and then I'm not really physically needing to scale out. So there's some situations where that may be appropriate, but mostly when people are like, I need to throw CPU and memory at the problem and scale this thing in some way, it would be really nice if those 3 were running on separate physical hosts, which typically they are in the cloud. When you do that, it's very, very odd. And there's plenty of capacity to do that. If I think about disk for a second, if you go from 1 disk for I/O over here becomes, let's say, 3 disks. So just +1 disk, +1 disk. And so let's say you had some limitations on IOPS of 256 IOPS going to 1 disk. You would want to not have 3 virtual disks on the same physical volume because you still might be bottlenecked by that single physical volume. You would want to scale out 3 disks onto 3 totally separate physical volumes. So storage groups in the cloud, you could assign totally different disks. You're going to get guaranteed IOPS if you get 3 physical. If you're doing it yourself, if you're like, oh, I put 3 virtual hard drives on the same physical disk, you're not going to get 3 times the bandwidth out of that. So again, you've got this physical to virtual sort of slicing things up. And if you've got one machine that you add 3 disks to, well, what if you've got one data file and you're writing to one data file? If you've got one log file, well, what do I do with those 3 disks? Do I have to RAID them together? Do I make a logical volume of some kind? Maybe virtualize that disk, 3 physical disks. So you have to make sure, if you are really running this platform and running the infrastructure yourself, hey, the app is only writing to one log file, but I need to put faster disk behind that one log file. So I might scale up the speed of the disk by going to SSD or faster disk before I actually add multiple disks. The other thing to think, like if you're doing this with a database, you could have multiple data files in parallel. So in parallel, you could be, but is your query set up physically so that you're actually, let's say you're partitioned, you might only be writing to the main partition on one of those data files and the other 2 are quiet. You're not really in parallel. So you need to do some analysis about, hey, I'm scaling out the IO so I can write or read in parallel to all 3 or 10 or 8 or 100 of those disks, that kind of piece. And of course, network is very similar to that, like I just talked about. You can go from one network card and you could, on each machine, you could go to having network card A and B. So you actually double that. But do I team those 2 cards together? Sure, I've scaled out the physical resources. Let's say those 2 NICs, network cards, network adapters that I added, I team them together on my host. So now there's some load balancing in the world. It looks like one IP address, but I've got, instead of 1 gig, I have 2 gig. Instead of 40 gigabytes, I have 80 gigabits per second, excuse me. If those 2 connections end up on a switch over in the closet or in the data center over there, and the real bottleneck is that switch uplinked somewhere else, you could add 100 NICs and your bottleneck is actually not on the local network adapter. It's on the switch upstream. So when you think about scaling out network, you can't just think about your local node. You have to think about, all right, where's all of this bandwidth? If I actually make my machine talk faster, will I oversaturate a switch? Maybe my 2 cables that are on that switch are in the same ASIC. Well, I want to move them both to 2 separate ASICs so I can blast the backplane on that switch much, much better. So that's the idea with network, is again, physically. Now, so scaling up and scaling out, you're taking the monolith and making the monolith bigger, better, faster, and more. If you're scaling out, you're breaking the monolith into, you're cloning it, or it's mitosis, right? So you can end up with copies of the same thing and run them in parallel, and that's sort of scaling things out. You can scale out the entire, go from 1 machine, CPU disk memory network, to 5 machines, CPU disk memory network. Or you can scale out individual resources on a specific machine. But that's the idea. You got to really master load balancing stuff. So that brings me to my next question, and I'm going to make some comments about this as well. And this is where the conversation got interesting for me this week, was obviously talking about auto scalability and elasticity, Kubernetes, the ability of a system to expand, auto scale, and then come back. And the comment I will say from a scale, those are scale out systems, and they are automatically scale out systems. And again, you need to, if you're running your own clusters on your own physical infrastructure, you need to make sure that as it expands, you have the physical infrastructure to support that expansion. Setting your replica sets. How many pods can you run? How many, do I have enough master nodes to support all the worker nodes that are coming from a elasticity perspective? It does support scalability, but it's not infinite scalability. It's certainly not infinite from a cost perspective. Basically, the 2 rules I'll share with you, or the 2 tips or suggestions, rules for me, but for you, it's just to think about. One is, with that elasticity, we're talking about auto scaling or auto expanding resources, CPU disk memory network, on the fly. And the speed with which, and this is maybe relevant to Ticketmaster, because I don't know how elastic they are. Last I talked with someone at Ticketmaster, I told them they shouldn't be elastic. They should be pre-provisioned to handle a spike. And that's where I will say a spike, the murderousness of a spike, is that you have some traffic going along, and then boom, that traffic goes up to 10 times the volume, 10x the volume. And then things get really strange, and there's blood, and people die, kittens, and it never recovers. And you know, this is lost money, and you see the little dollar signs and the tears of your sad Taylor Swift fans that are over here crying. You know, it's terrible, and they're walking away. And then there's somebody who's, you know, it's just kind of ridiculous. But setting aside the humor of this for a second, this critical time between elapsed time, this spike where you're increasing those resources, it's just like that other graph that I was like a slow increasing amount of scale, but it happens within like 30 seconds or a minute. The system's ability to add resources, to identify that you're running out of resources. And so to me, there's an SLA that you would say, which is the time to expand, the time to grow. It's to everything there is a turn was the song, right? Right? A time to grow, a time to scale, a time for CPU, a time for memory. Anyway, I'll stop that. Not singing very well today. You get the idea that I have response times, and I can measure those. And I have throughput, I have CPU resources, I can measure those. There is a critical measurement, which is like response time, but it is how much time does it take from reaching the maximum throughput on container A to the point where I'm spinning up container B. And also then configuring from a Kubernetes standpoint, am I always 3 containers ahead of where I need to be? So you can mess with those thresholds to say, well, don't just fire up 1 container. The first time this guy exhausts, fire up 2 containers, and then start filling up this container. And maybe when it reaches this point, it fires up that container. So you could find a way to measure from the point that container 1 gets exhausted to the point that container 2 is fully up, warmed up, cached, running, and taking on traffic. And if that takes 2 minutes, and believe me, with a complex application, if you've got a lot of things to warm up, it could take 2 minutes. Sure, to fire up the container, it only takes maybe 5 seconds. But there's a lot of other things that have to happen to fire up on a complex container. And that may argue that you are trying to auto-scale the monolith instead of breaking it into lots of little granular pieces that can scale. In general, all systems that are doing lazy loading, lazy class loading, caching, warm up, all that kind of stuff, you are always better off having more little machines than a very few big machines. Because to warm up the monolith, a giant thing, scaling up and warming up, you'll take just as much time to scale that up as you would, I need to fire up 10 more machines. And so if I restart them, doesn't take that much to warm them up because they're actually really small machines. There's only so many threads needed. The configurations are smaller. So in general, what we've learned as an industry is if you can manage lots of little machines better, it's better for performance generally. The warm-up time, the startup time is there. But you should be measuring time to expand, time to grow, to keep up with the scale. And if that time takes a minute, but you've got to go from 0 Taylor Swift tickets to 10,000 transactions per second Taylor Swift tickets in under a minute, you don't have time to scale. You don't have time to let those thresholds where you need to be 5 steps ahead or 5 minutes ahead of that, which there's a whole other episode in the PerfBytes podcast world that are sort of like, shouldn't I take telemetry inbound from non-technical, read the news headlines, weather, Taylor Swift, when's the tour date? Shouldn't I use that and say, oh, within the next 24 hours, We know there's these scheduled events in the human world, and the machines would be like, all right, just in case that event causes load on me, I'm gonna double the rate. I'm gonna warm up and have in reserve n number of extra threads, n number of extra machines. And so that is, again, a part of scale up and scale out strategies. I will say, reminded by my own systems, head of systems at my work, was like, look, it's just way easier sometimes to be like, you want more CPU, I can just re-roll your VM and away you go. And if you've got a couple VMs, you can load balance one, ramp them up and whatever. That may be a thing you could do this next week for Black Friday, as some of you are preparing. You know it's coming, although a lot of the Black Fridays sales are all the time now. Justin, my colleague, and I were talking about that. Yeah, thinking about scaling out stuff, scaling up and scaling out. And since you know there's some events coming next week, now's the time to say, we normally have the replica set here, but let's lower the threshold for spawning other and expanding the cluster to more pods in the workers. Let's lower that threshold so that we can actually trigger and fire up more of these. They can still run over that amount, but they'll trigger the next expansion a little bit lower than we might normally do. Or just physically fire up, all right, look, for the holidays, we're gonna run 10 more machines than we normally run. And everything's gonna run a little lower, but at least we have headroom. That's really, really important. And that's when you think about scalability, again, that the important thing is, can I increase the load on the system without getting slower or without ruining the end user's experience? Do I have other, there's all sorts of ways to analyze this from the web client perspective, third-party resources. If you have a blocker of a third-party resource and they don't scale, but the rest of your stuff does, then all it takes is one user to say, hey, this looks like it's blocked over there, that kind of stuff. And how can I continue to load the page without a slow third-party component? The web performance side of things is really, really important to analyze as well for scalability, or at least removing blockers to the individual's experience in that way. So good luck, as usual. Again, CPU, disk memory, network are your friends, and study how you add those resources either on the fly by rolling more nodes, or by having to re-roll a machine with more CPU and more memory. And what does it take to do that? How long does it take to do that if you're under fire to do that? Okay, scalability in 2022. Yeah, I guess it's pretty good. It's a little bit of the old, a little bit of the new. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the completely LinkedIn user who I don't know who it is. They won't say who it is, but they've been listening to the podcast since 2014, which is right about the same time we started the podcast. So thanks for joining us. Whoever they are, they're not in the chat, but I'll say thank you. Thank you too. Long-time listener. It's really, really cool. Fantastic. You can obviously you can check out PerfBytes in the YouTube world where you are, wherever you're watching right now. But to get more information about PerfBytes, there is a perfbytes.com website. You could follow PerfBytes Español with my friend, senior performer Leandro Melendez. There is a News of the Damned still alive out there by the Senior Pulley, who we should be seeing something about this time. Usually around Black Friday, he has like a marathon crashing websites, and we'll see if he can come out with that. News of the Damned is really good. Check out the books. There's a books section. So Leandro and James have both written books. I think there's a third one as well. So we have PerfBytes Press, which is really, really cool. And again, I will be down in Whopper, a workshop on performance reliability in Uruguay, and the conference, Quality Sense conference on December 9th, 2022 in Montevideo, Uruguay. I'm also still on the side of still filling in. I can't call it filling in now. I teach a introduction to performance and load testing through TechWell, through Coveros, the training partners. And I have one coming in mid-December, January, end of January, and I think February or March, maybe in March. So there's a couple of those coming up. It's not tool specific or anything. It's about, I have some QA managers or people that are leads on teams that are taking on performance work. And it's a really, really fun class. So if you're interested in that, head over to Caveros.com and other stuff like that. There's some other events happening in the world. Test Bash is happening. Inflectra is happening in the spring. They just announced they're going to be in Inflectra. Those that don't know, STPCon, our good friend Rick, is working over at Inflectra. And so the STPCon world is sort of in Inflectra at this point. So if you did join us for STPCon, you might see us again down in DC. I think it's in DC again at inflectra.com, the conference as well. Awesome. If I don't hop online during my copious amounts of free time over the Turkey Day, have a great Thanksgiving and eat safely. Cook that turkey to appropriate temperature and enjoy your time with friends and family and be well. I will see you in the next PerfBytes. Take care, everybody.